presentation is about waste assessment. Hi, I'm John Michael Hulse, a professor at SMC in Earth Science and a national expert in waste assessment. Waste assessment is a metric that can tell us a lot about our business and our life. For instance, being able to distinguish between plastic bags and jellies is quite important, as SpongeBob might tell us. I've spent decades studying wasting in all its forms. It's all around us. It permeates the fabric of our society, as well as our bodies now, if you've kept up with the latest research on plastics and toxins in the environment. But it's important to note that waste is a very peculiar thing. You see, waste is only waste as we define it, as we see it. Waste is an act, not a noun. For some, waste is simply an inefficiency, a resource out of place, like a weed, just another name for a flower that is out of place. Waste can be gaseous, like CO2 from a coal plant, but we know CO2 is absolutely essential for plants to use as their breathable atmosphere and exchanging oxygen uh, in return. Or it could be liquid, like gasoline leaking from an underground storage tank. We're all familiar with running the water in our homes and businesses, washing our hands, clothes, for instance, while the residues of dirt and stuff are flushed down the drain. Maybe we leave the water on way too long, or simply forget about it until much later, and then berate ourselves for wasting money. Waste can also be solid in nature, like a tin can or a torn shirt that we casually toss away in the trash. And there are wastes from agriculture, from mining, from industry, from our cars, our toilets, and our sinks. We may even be wasting without even knowing that we are. How's that? If you wear synthetic fiber clothes, you are a walking point source of microfibers and microplastics, for example. These tiny fibers and particles float away as we walk and work, wafting away with the breeze, or in the ventilation system in buildings whereupon they are breathed in by coworkers or friends and family. But what I'm focusing today is, is really just a very slim segment of waste, namely municipal solid waste, which represents less than 2% of all waste in the U.S. today. So when I talk about all the waste, agriculture, mining, industry, everything else, all those things really move us towards the ultimate in wasting, which is as consumers, we create municipal solid waste. So it's an important part because it represents the cream, so to speak, of all the other waste in our society. Everything else that wastes really goes into making products, packaging, and cleaning. The things that we use, cups, paper, worn shoes, bottles, food residue at home and in business, these become MSW, municipal solid waste. So all the other 98% converges to the 2% that we put into our trash cans and bins. It's why every pound of MSW embodies an average of 70 times its weight in upstream waste. So when we throw away something, we're really throwing away 70 some things. And if we reduce, reuse, and recycle, we're avoiding the wasting of 70 some things every single time. So we can really deal wasting a big blow just by focusing on the simple things that we could reduce, reuse, recycle. We just have to understand that working backwards from downstream to upstream is very hard. As consumers, if we're the only ones involved in solving the issue and nobody turns off the spigot of wasting upstream, making more and more stuff, that's going to be really hard to solve the issue. So we need government and business to work together to turn off this spigot of wasting upstream. And we know that going downstream is always a bit easier because that's how things flow. And it's why in my universe, I always start upstream to understand why, how, where, and when resources become wasted. That's the essence of waste assessment, to understand its origins and maybe to find ways to eliminate it before it's generated. Perhaps you've heard this phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's true about waste and why zero waste companies go upstream to fix systemic issues and avoid having to manage waste. Now, to solve a problem, we need to identify and assess the problem, quantify it, qualify it, dissect it, label it, understand it. With facts compiled in time and space, we can make an assessment which can lead us to a solution or a series of solutions. There are two main ways we can do this in waste assessment. One is to actually physically sort and characterize waste components. It's like dumpster diving. You probably heard that term. Or we can visually characterize waste by volume and certain qualities that it has. By physical, we need to obtain an actual sample of waste and then hand sort it into its discrete parts. This can happen anywhere along the resource to waste train, from point of generation to aggregation and storage bins. We call that pre-collection, and eventually to post-collection after things are picked up, like in a big truck. In other words, we can assess discards then after they're commingled in compactor trucks and taken to a transfer station or a landfill. Now, by visual, we're simply observing waste and denoting estimations of its various qualities. For example, the U.S. Zero Waste Business Council, which is now part of LEED and the U.S. Green Building Council, does visual audits. Now, on the other hand, LEED certification still requires a physical sort. The former, this physical sort, is quite gross, while the latter, visual, is generally much cleaner. And as a consequence, I like to do visual rather than physical, because I've done plenty of physical assessment and it is just disgusting. So we're going to examine each of these methods in a little more detail in the following slides. Thank you. Just bear with me. Physical characterization. Hand sorting our discards helps us to identify and quantify by weight the various components. That means breaking down discards into fiber, metals, glass, plastics, organics, and more. Generally, most such studies use up to 12 to 13 categories for composition. However, some studies have used many more categories to identify as much as possible about waste. I've included a link to this slide to a waste composition study performed on post-collection household discards, and that was done by a consultant, Cascadia. The recycling composition data was based on 210 hand-sorted samples of at least 200 pounds each. They aggregated 84 material types used during field sorting and then condensed these into 21 material categories designed to showcase the acceptable and contaminating materials. I typically use the 12 master categories of recyclable materials that was developed by Dan Knapp, Dr. Dan Knapp, and Mary Lou Van Deventer of Urban Ore in the Bay Area of California. And this 12 master categories actually includes reusable goods, that's intact or repairable home or industrial appliances, household goods, clothing, intact materials and demolition debris such as lumber, doors, windows, cabinets, sinks, business supplies and equipment, lighting fixtures, and any other manufactured item or naturally occurring object that can be repaired or used again as is. That's reusable. There's paper, fiber, newsprint, ledger paper, computer paper, corrugated cardboard. That's like, cardboard boxes. And mixed paper. Metals, that's the third category. That's both ferrous and non-ferrous. Ferrous referring to iron, steel. Non-ferrous is things that are not steel, not iron. Okay, that's like brass and copper, things of that nature. And that includes cans, parts from abandoned vehicles, plumbing, fences, metal doors and screens, tools, machinery, and any other discarded metal objects. There's glass. That's the fourth category, including glass containers and window glass, because there are two different types of glass. There's textiles. That's fifth. That includes non-reusable clothing, upholstery, and pieces of fabric. Plastics, sixth item, including beverage containers, plastic packaging, plastic cases of consumer goods, such as telephones or electronic equipment, films, and tires. Plant debris. That includes leaves and cuttings, trimmings from trees, shrubs, and grass, whole plants, and sawdust. Putrescibles. That's a fancy word for like food waste and stuff. But that includes animal, fruit, vegetable debris, cooked food, manures, offal, that's OFFAL, that's like when you chop up an animal, and sewage sludge. There's also a ninth category, wood, strictly a category in itself, including non-reusable lumber, tree rounds, pallets, because a lot of pallets are made out of wood. And especially if they get broken, they get tossed in the trash. A 10th category is ceramics, like cups and saucers, but also rock and tile, brick, concrete, plaster, and asphalt. 11th category is soils, including excavation soils from barren or developed land, excess soils from people's yards. A 12th category, last category, is chemicals, including acids and bases, solvents, fuels, lubricating oils, and medicines, because all these things do get thrown into the trash, one way, shape, or form. Now, there's many methods that have been developed over the years to characterize discards. Each method is based on the anticipated use of the data. For example, folks have developed methodologies to determine the design requirements of a compost facility, in which case it would be useful to learn about the compostable fraction of the waste. What's compostable? Incineration, and folks that are designing incinerators would want to know the burnable and non-burnable fractions, as well as the calorific, the energy value, how much BTU per pound, the amount of potential residue, things that won't burn, like metals, because that's going to turn into something in an incinerator that can be very difficult for its operation. And also the moisture content. If something's really wet and you're trying to burn it, it's not going to burn until you drive off the moisture, or it's been evaporated in some way prior to the actual combustion. So that in many ways, that's why incinerators take a lot more energy than you can get out of it. Even though trash might have like 5,000 BTUs, you got to use 10,000 BTUs to get to the point where the 5,000 BTUs are available to burn. Composition can vary widely based on source. For example, restaurant versus retail. Obviously, a restaurant's going to have a different waste than a clothing store. It could be a sector, like residential versus non-residential. An office building generates a little bit different trash from a apartment complex. And it could be season, holiday time versus non-holiday time. People go on vacation in the summer, so there could be less trash at certain types of businesses. During the growing times of the year, we generate more lawn debris than during the winter. It can also be geography, rural versus urban, entirely different sets of waste. And it can be different parts of the country. If you're in a part of the country that's very wet, a lot of your trash is going to be very wet. And if you're like in Phoenix, Arizona, your waste might be very dry, and quite a bit dry. So in this slide, I've provided the waste audit methodology for LEAD, which requires a full day's worth of trash to be sorted, all the trash from a facility. The day selected must be typical, in other words, not influenced by those types of things that I mentioned above, especially weekends, special events, holidays, and stuff. And both recycling and trash bins must be assessed. And once everything is sorted and quantified, it supposedly represents everything generated for disposal. Okay, so just keep that in mind as I go on to the next slide, and next couple of slides. Now this slide shows you a typical picture of waste characterization before sorting. This is what you might find in a trash container if you dumped everything out of the trash, out of the dumpster. You can see that there's bags of material, and obviously this particular location, there's a lot of people drinking beer. But you got to tear apart these bags if you're going to assess it to get into what's in that bag. And so, like I say, you never know what you're getting, so it can be quite gross. And please note there's other factors that can influence what data you obtain. For instance, in a business or home, generators will package their discards into plastic bags, just like they've done here. This often can add significant amounts of plastics to the discards that actually were not discarded. In other words, they were purposely put into the trash in order to containerize on a temporary basis stuff so it could be easily carted out to a location, to a dumpster, where it was then put into the container. Most businesses, for example, employ janitors, and the janitors will have plastic bags. They'll empty little baskets into their plastic, you know, uh, their drum, which has a plastic bag in it. And when it's full, they tie it up and leave it off to the side. And once they go through an area, maybe they have 2, 3, 4 bags of material taken from all over an office, just as an example. And then that's got to be taken over to the trash container. And maybe they roll that out there on some special, little tray or something, a rolling tray, and then they heave them into the dumpster. And so you got to break all those things apart. What happens is that as people go through and collect all this stuff, you're commingling everything. You don't know where exactly things really come from. And these plastic bags often mask components. So you're hiding various materials from visual inspection. That's an area that visual inspection kind of fails. You can't really see unless the bags are clear what really is in the containers. And you can see here in this picture that bags that are kind of white, opaque, are difficult to see through, and the black bags you really can't see at all. So that represents a challenge for anybody doing a visual sort. Well, after after sorting, you've taken that everything, where it's all mixed up. Now you've sorted it and you have everything, the various materials organized and kind of ready to weigh. Sometimes you can weigh them along the path of doing your sorting, but a lot of times people will put them into, like here, they put them into areas, but you could put it into buckets. And when the bucket is full, you got to go weigh it and then dump it to some other location near to where you're sorting and continue to fill it up with material. Like here, I can see paper products are in the upper part. There's plastics on the left. There's food waste at the bottom. There's other types of packaging, paper packaging in one side, and probably there might be other things as well. Here, there's no metals. I don't see any ceramics. I don't see rubber. I don't see, things of that nature. I don't see wood, but I do see food waste, plastics, paper waste, and you can see sometimes that you really have to be careful because you can see those red, packaging is made out of paper, and sometimes you got to tear it to see whether it's paper or plastic because they look alike, so it's kind of sometimes can be a little bit difficult. The idea here is you tally all the weights, giving us the total weight, and then the individual categories can be assessed or compared to the total, yielding their relative compositional fractions. Like here, food waste may end up being 25% by weight, maybe 15% by volume. Plastic might be 20, 30% by volume, but only 5 or 10% by weight. because it's very light. So that's another thing that, physically assessing everything can be very important, is that you yield highly quantifiable results as opposed to visual estimation. I can only guess based on experience and knowledge about what these things might be. Another aspect that we consider is that there are various emission factors that can be assigned to households and businesses, like a per employee estimate or emission estimate. In other words, like the state of California, for example, has developed emission factors for office buildings, for a variety of different types of business practices and business operations. And an office complex, the typical employee might generate a certain amount per day, and it might contain certain things like 80% paper. So so some of our agencies, federal government as well as state government, have provided us a variety of different emission factors that we can use, that if we do have like the total number of employees, we can make assessments against our characterizations to assure that we're kind of like cross checks that we're in the right ballpark. Okay. For example, when I did that waste characterization study for a LEED certification for a building in Orange County, which was on the 5th slide, we found that there was a significant amount of material overlooked. Stuff never made it to the trash and recycling enclosure. In fact, over half of what was generated was diverted due to confidential paper destruction. In other words, this material was stored on every floor of the building complex, but then diverted to the loading dock by a CBD firm who destroyed the material through certified recycling. They shredded it and recycled it. If we had ignored this fact, then the total waste generated by the facility would have been woefully untallied, and the recycling rate for LEED purposes would have been grossly underreported. We found only like about 10-15% recycling in the dumpsters. In other words, like the trash dumpster with added to the recycling dumpster. When you did the calculations, it was only like 10 or 15% recycling. And the company was like going, whoa, we know we're recycling more than that. But in terms of assessing how things were moving within the building, identifying the fact that there was this confidential paper destruction going on, we got the weigh records from the confidential paper destruction firm, and then broke that down on a daily basis and added that to our assessment of this day's trash collection, because we were extrapolating from the day to the year, and here we had the year for paper destruction, so we're able to add that into our calculations and determine that they were at greater than 50% diversion. So that was a really important fact. So just something to keep in mind when doing these types of studies. There are many paths that solid waste can take that you have to really, be aware of. Well, visual assessment is really an eyeball methodology in which trained observers estimate the quality and quantity of materials found in waste. Just like physical hand sorting, visual estimation can be performed at any point in the waste generation cycle, from the point of generation to its ultimate destination. It's less costly than physical assessment. You don't need to sort things. You don't have people to sort stuff, because that takes a crew of people to do that. And you don't have to weigh anything and such. But it's also less precise. Not necessarily less accurate, it's just less precise. And where it shines, in terms of methodology, is its ability to make quick qualitative observations such as generation characteristics, load moisture content, general recoverability, stratification that might occur in waste collected, and other data that we might infer from observations to help us design collection systems and make upstream assessments of generation patterns. It's really important to break all this stuff up and, like I say, pick it apart. And you'll see later how my own methodologies can work very well with visual assessments to become extremely accurate in helping us to devise programs of waste reduction, prevention, reuse, and recycling. Okay, and this is a case study for visual assessment that I did for the city of Rancho Cucamonga. And we conducted a citywide audit in 2002. So I've been doing this for a long time. And we did it at One Hauler's MRF, a material recovery facility, which was sited next door in the city of Fontana. So all the waste from Rancho Cucamonga from two haulers was flow controlled to this MRF owned by one of the haulers. Okay, and when I say flow controlled, that means that the city directs by ordinance, directs any hauler by ordinance to deliver all the things they collect to a designated location. It could be a MRF, transfer station, or it could even be a landfill. The audit purpose was to basically to one, characterize the entire commercial waste stream using visual assessment over 4 seasons for 1 year, and then to support that with the actual weigh data. So we took a look at every single load in during these 4-week periods. So we took 1 week to over these different 4 seasons. When I say 4 seasons, it's like winter, spring, summer, and fall. Okay, because every part of the year has different generational patterns. Okay, so anyhow, we had the purpose to find ways to improve diversion because they were only getting 12% diversion in the city, and they needed to be at 50%. And we needed to do this within 1 year. So that's a big jump in diversion. So we did visual observations of every single load during these 4-week periods. And just like this truck that's backing up, I mean, we had to rush in, take a look, make our observations, and then get out of the way because the bulldozer was going to come through at this transfer station. You see in the background, there's another truck coming in. So I had to have, several people all take observations, and everybody had to be kind of trained, and they had to be able to make quick assessments of what they saw. Now, here you can see as this truck is coming up, you can make an assessment that it's kind of wet, it's kind of dry. There's a lot of dust. Some loads come in and they're just like pouring out a lot of material, a lot of water, a lot of liquid, and that may be indicative of like picking up from restaurants or a lot of yard waste and stuff like this. This could be very indicative of picking up from office complexes and stuff where things generally are drier. And I'll talk about that more, later in the presentation because we make these visual observations and try to determine recoverability of all these loads. And we identify the trucks and later figure out where their routes were and what things they picked up, because every hauler has route maps for every single vehicle, and these vehicles pick up pretty much the same things every single time they go out and pick up from the community. It may vary from day to day, but that particular day, like if it's a Monday, they're picking up like 40 different locations and they pick that up every Monday. So there's a lot of consistency on things. So if we can take these visual observations, we can extrapolate and take a look at where they're picking up and make qualified judgments on maybe ways that we can change out collection. And that's where stratification, as I'll describe later, becomes very important. We also identified self-hauled waste, and that's important too, but we'll go through that a bit later. Okay, so here's what we found at the Rancho Cucamonga audit. We identified all the vehicles, and we obtained their vehicular tare and full weights. Tare meaning their empty weight, and the full weight meaning everything including the tare weight. So you can take the full weight minus the tare weight, tells you how much is actually in the truck. And then we could take all of our compositional information from viewing all the different loads to come up with a recoverable fractions for the entire year. We can extrapolate our information from the week to the entire year, and from the different weeks to the entire year, and be able to determine how much recoverability was out there, and help us to actually determine what we could do in terms of collection. And what we were looking at was, we did all the residential trucks and we kept that data separate. We took a look at the commercial refuse trucks and that data was separate. We took a look at roll-off trucks. That's a large 30 or 40 cubic yard bin that comes from a single source. And we kept that information available. And then we also took a look at self-haul vehicles. And for each load that came off of all those trucks, we identified things like how wet it was, how dry it was, recoverability. We assessed it based on the clean dozen, which is those dozen different categories, and also by truck type and really more. And when I say more, it's like residential, we knew that there was recycling truck, trash truck, and green waste truck. So we had 3 sets of data that we could take a look at, and we could take a look at what wasn't being captured by the residential recycling system. We saw stuff still in the trash. And for commercial, same way. There may be limited amount of commercial recycling, but a lot of times people don't do a good job of sorting, separating at their offices or their factories or wherever they may be. And that's where the idea of how wet something is, how dry something is, the recoverability really comes well into play. Because if we just pick up what's convenient, you drive down the street, you pick up you pick up restaurant, you pick up a garden supply place, you go to an office building, and as you're going through there, you're just throwing everything into the truck. It's gross contamination. Cross contamination is just horrible. And as a consequence, stuff that, might have been really good, and even recoverable, if somebody went through and did some hand sorting at the MRF, they're not going to be able to recover it, because how can you take wet paper and try to separate it? It's just impossible, So all that, we can encourage or increase the amount of recoverability, from an entire system. And that's what we did. We were able to then develop wet dry routes. So instead of picking up what's convenient, and I'll talk a little bit about this later about stratification, but we were able to actually reorganize how things are collected. And so a truck, instead of picking up what's convenient, would pick up all the offices, and another truck would pick up all the restaurants, keeping wet away from dry. And then the dry became very easy to put into the sorting system for recyclables at the MRF. And consequently, even if there was source separation at the businesses, people are not so good at separating. They were able to actually recover even more. And one company I work with quite a bit does source separation, and that's their first effort to get people to do stuff. But then they back it up with this dry route, in which all the dry route stuff is sorted and separated at their MRF, and they get even more diversion. So instead of just like maybe 20 or 30% diversion, they get 60, 70% diversion when they have to source separated to the the post-collection processing. Okay, so that becomes really important. So the idea of wet and dry is more of a rational look at how we can collect things, and not just pick up what's convenient, because what's convenient, there is no rhyme or reason generally out there in the business community. So somebody has to make that determination when they route their trucks. so that they're picking up things that are consistent so that one truck comes back and it's consistently more recoverable, dry. And those that are wet generally have a lot of organics and food waste. It's good for composting, so you can see that that really can help. And another thing too is that the roll-off trucks, when I say they come from single sources, if we take a look at it, that's like the Walmarts, oh my gosh, Home Depots, places like that. Well, they have a big bin in back. It could be a compactor, it could be a non-compactor. So if people put everything from that source, it's not any other source. It's not any other business. It's their own. And so when that comes in, that's a nice snapshot of that business. And if it's really a recoverable material that they're throwing away, maybe 50, 60, 75% recoverable, we can go back to that source and say, excuse me, do you know how much money you're losing and how much money you could gain and the benefit of doing this program, of avoiding waste in the landfill? And if we work with the hauler on that, it can end up being a real win-win, both for the generator as well as the hauler. And so by doing that, and like on this slide here, I said the top 10 generators, we found a good top 10 that produced 10% of all the waste in the city in the commercial sector. And so we set up programs at those top 10 generators, and bingo, we were getting 90% diversion right off the bat from that. And then when we set up the wet dry route to go along with it, and so now the haulers were bringing in materials that were more easily recyclable or compostable. We got 50% diversion the first full week of the program. And so it went from 12% to 50%, bingo, like overnight. So that's why waste assessment can be very, very useful. Now, that's sort of like on a city scale. Okay, so keep that in mind, city scale. We can also do things on a individual scale. Like when I said, the top 10 generators. Okay, let's examine that. Okay, so I went to a small retailer. It was a Michael's Art Supply. And in a 2-hour site visit, it was conducted with an employee meeting and a tour of the premises, and we viewed the different sources. And I'll get into the sources and stuff, but there was retail floor, cash registers, small office, managers in there, a receiving dock and storage where all the new products go in and the trash gets sent out, a work area for framing because they do a lot of framing. There was a lunchroom and a bathroom, and also there was a lot of customers' trash as well. People would bring in stuff and they, deposit it in little containers all over the place. Well, the whole thing was that everything was collected by the janitors at the end of the day, and or the employees, and they put it into one trash compactor. Okay, so everything got commingled. Like I say, we see the compactor and we see all this recoverable material. We came back to Michael's and said, it's like, let us help you to change how you do things. And a lot of like, oh, complaining and things like that. But okay, we'll listen to what you got to say. Okay. So I took a look at their cost. They were spending like $600 a month on their trash compactor. And that was like $7,200 a year. Our audit showed there was only a small amount of trash from employees and customers' trash. 95% of the waste were recoverable. And so the 5% that was not, that was the trash. So 95%. Well, they were like, they're going like, oh my gosh, how are we going to sort all that stuff? And I said, hold, time out. You don't have to sort the 95%. All we want you to do is sort the 5% that is not recoverable. Oh, so when they only had to sort out 5% and leave the 95% recoverable in the same bin, which was converted from trash to recycling compactor, and then we added a small bin for the trash, everybody was happy. It was a win-win. And after the container rentals were deducted, the cost of extraction by the hauler, there was actual revenue. $1,500 a year came back to Michael's as a check every month. $1,500 divided by 12, what, $125 a month. The key thing was that instead of $600 a month cost, it became a $125 payment to Michael's. That was a positive a flip of $8,700. Now you tell me, what could Michael's do with an extra $8,700? Well, they decided to give themselves a party and, end of the year Christmas party and bonuses for people. Everybody was happy. So, I mean, that was a real example of how, it was good for the city because the city got extra diversion. It was good for the hauler because the hauler still had all the same, you might say, costs that they got back from the company. In other words, like they, Michaels could have made more if they had done their own recycling. You know, if they had done everything themselves, like be a do-it-yourselfer, but they didn't want to do that because they're not experts in marketing. They're not experts in keeping all this stuff sorted and stuff. They just let the hauler do it. And so the hauler took all their costs and they took all the revenues. They took all the costs and compared that to the revenues, and yet there was still $1,500 a year left over, which they rebated back to Michael's. So that's a real win-win situation, and how waste assessment can help us to develop in-house programs. So I have to ask you, what's in your zero waste toolkit? As my friend the actor it would say, what's in your wallet? Well, what's in your zero waste toolkit? And I have a zero waste toolkit. It's my assessment methodology. It's advanced tools for use by experienced and trained auditors. And what it is, let's get down into the weeds, so to speak. And the intent is to try to understand how waste is generated, right? And we need to observe the discards based on 9 generic source categories. And I'll talk about each of these source categories. And by source, I mean homes or businesses. There's a variety of different businesses, but they fit into, you might say, not quite SIC codes, but they do fit into 9 categories. And each category has very specific characteristics. Material, you might say material content, what they generate, how they generate, all these types of things. And I'll go through all this, okay? So you can observe all these things on the 9 source categories, and then we can, understand the characteristics of load picked up from these sources and determine ways that we can go upstream to kind of pick apart the waste shed. And this may include reformatting how we collect waste, that stratification, but these 9 generating source categories are the secret sauce. That's my secret sauce, okay? This beautiful picture of Murph. How wonderful it is to work in a place like this, ain't it? Not. But in any event, these are the 9 generating sources that I use. It's something that the Zero Waste Business Council, true Zero Waste, uses as well. And I've used it to do thousands and thousands of waste audits at buildings and businesses and apartments and all kinds of places. And they help me to devise diversion systems for each area or each facility. And I've never failed to get less than 63% diversion at any place. Okay, so this is good stuff. And you could subcategorize them into even more generating sources, because you can see, for example, industrial and services could be a huge category. But I have to ask why, Simplicity is best. I could organize things into even more categories, but it's not necessary, and I'll explain why. So these 9 categories of generation sources can be wet or dry. Food services, grounds, housing, and hospitality generally are wet because there's more food. Um, construction and demolition, industrial, offices, retail, vehicular maintenance, warehouse, and distribution, they tend to be dry, and they tend to be consistent in the types of materials generated. And what's really interesting is that this works micro, macro level. In other words, like every community has all these types of 9 generating sources. And every business in a community or institution can contain up to all 9 categories of generating sources. So when you understand each generating source, you can evaluate a source and come up with opportunities for basically reformatting how things are collected and handled and managed, and affect greater diversion than you could imagine from just taking something at the end of the pipe and then trying to recycle that. No, you got to go up the system. You got to go up into the network of things happening at a facility, because like in the picture here in this little, GIF, you can see that what comes in is so mixed. I mean, it's just all kinds of stuff. But if you could go back upstream and find all the origins of this stuff, it would be so much easier to sort it upstream. And that's really the key. And that's a way that companies, businesses, and others can end up saving a lot and making a lot. So these 9 sources, source types, and the main materials that they generate. I have 9 of them, and like I say, food services is one. Restaurants and food markets and food processors and food gardens and bakeries, food trucks. There's a lot of food scraps and waste. Wet organics, it's just basically organic matter. There's grounds, cemeteries, ball fields, road medians, golf courses, and they generally create yard debris and more wet organics. Think about like a cemetery. They got a lot of grounds, a lot of plots, and what do they have generally? A lot of grass, that they have to mow. And you think of ball fields, a lot of lawn area and such. Golf course is the same thing. So grounds can also be like around a building, and so we'll go over that in a minute. Housing and hospitality. It's like apartments and hotels. It's a mixture of residential type waste. Just hotels, motels, apartments all kind of create a lot of things that are very similar. They look like residential waste. So we leave the wet and start into the dry, materials and sources. Like fourth is the construction and demolition, building sites and roads and tear downs, things of that nature. And they produce inert, that's like concrete, things like that, rubble, wood, masonry, wallboard, roofing. All this stuff is very dry, dusty, things of that nature. Rocks are included. Fifth is industrial and services. Okay, this is the big category. That's like everything imaginable that is industrial and services. Factories, manufacturing, fabrication, maintenance yards, dry cleaning, medical, schools, even SMC is part of industrial and services. And really, there's nothing that typifies them all together, but in and of themselves, their materials depend on type of operation. For example, like if you have a factory that makes rubber widgets, like maybe gaskets or something, what do you think their wastes are going to be at the end of the day? It's going to be a lot of rubber. If you go to woodworking factory, At the end of the day, what are they going to produce as a waste? It's going to be a lot of wood. Maybe it's a pallet manufacturer. They're going to have a lot of wood. So every single one source, of individual facilities within this source category tend to generate the same type of waste. Every dry cleaner produces almost the exact same material. Every McDonald's, a restaurant, even though they're in food services right now, let me just jump into that. They produce the same material in every single McDonald's. There's no variation because it's all kind of factory or like a factory, a food factory. Well, in most industrial and services, they likewise tend to be that same way. So that's something that you can use to your advantage to kind of make it a little simpler in terms of determining what are the types of waste and then what type of opportunities that might exist for separation and recycling and or waste prevention. That's even more important than recycling. A sixth category, offices, high-rise buildings, but also low-rise offices. Even home offices, my gosh. Um, what do you produce? Fiber, paper, electronics, plastics. And these days, in COVID times, we get a lot of packaging like cardboard boxes and stuff. Well, offices, according to EPA, are about 80% paper. 80%. So I ask you, if every office is like that, and if I pick up all those offices and they haven't been doing a good job of recycling, I should be able to get a heck of a lot of paper. And so for dry sorting, dry waste sorting, oh my gosh, I could get even more if people miss, what they're trying to do in their source separation program. All right, so that's very helpful. Um, Retail. Okay, that's malls and strip centers, brick and mortar stores, and basically producing fiber and textiles and plastics. And pretty much it's consistent all around. Vehicular maintenance, gas stations, auto dealers, tire and engine repair. They're all producing lubricants and fiber and plastics and polymers like rubber and stuff like that. And when I say fiber, packaging, because a lot of products come in packaging. They break that down, put it on their shelves, put it into their storage areas so that when they work on cars or they work on vehicles, they're going to be able to get what they need and install it, and then the paper can be either recycled or most of the time it gets just thrown away. Warehousing and distribution, any kind of warehousing and distribution center and buildings, and that includes online retail fulfillment like Amazon. Okay, plastics and fiber, wood pallets and metal. And I'll give you some examples of this, but what's really important is that there are individual sources that fit within these, but every single source can have any or all of these as part of a subsource. Okay, so we'll go through that. So if I was profiling, doing a supply demand profile, which is what I call it, some people call that waste audits. I call it a supply demand profile. Here we're looking at the business, which is product distribution or redistribution. There's many of these, and some cities have a lot of them. Some cities have very little of them. Depending upon how they're you might say the type of retailers they have in town and characteristics of their community and such. But for the typical warehouse distribution center, um, it's considered a category, warehouse distribution. But like I say, even inside a warehouse distributor, you're going to find the sources, identified here. And there's an office. Often warehouses, my gosh, I've never been to a warehouse distribution that didn't have an office for somebody, to keep track of things and to run payroll and answer the phones and make orders and, keep track of products and stuff as they go through the facility, so a business office is a very big part of it. And guess what? The office generates paper. 80% or more paper comes from that little business office. But also there's a food service, sort of a food area where the employees go when they have lunch, or maybe they're working around the clock and there's lunch times at different times of the day and night, and maybe people bring their food in and then they throw it in the trash, whatever they leave behind. And then there's also grounds. There may be landscaping around this facility, maybe lawns of varying size, depending on how far they want this building to be separated from its neighbors and things. And they generate a lot of grounds type waste, landscaping. And then there may or may not be any construction, that in this particular example, there's no current construction, so it's zilch, zip. And then another source would be the industrial and services. In other words, like what goes on inside this warehouse. Materials come in and they're received, they're depackaged, they're reorganized maybe into smaller packages, and then off this material goes into another truck for shipment to the consumers or to the consuming locations, retailers. So like generally warehouses and distributors are where major manufacturers send materials to, and they come to an area, and then their big boxes are broken down into smaller containers or repackaged, and then that whole repackaging, process is their industry, is their service, and they're generating a lot of paper out of that, or plastic, shrink wrap, things of that nature. Okay, so that's their industrial activity. Now, there may or not be a retail component, and I've seen some places that actually sell stuff where people can come in and buy something, but most don't have retail. And then there's housing and hospitality, like a restroom, a lounge area to rest and stuff like that. And in a restroom, they're creating paper towels, and maybe they're changing clothes, and a variety of things. But it's generally hospitality or housing type waste. So all in-house sources contribute to waste in the dumpsters. But I can tell you, in a warehouse distributor, the huge amount of materials, like 80–90% is cardboard. And then there's plastic, and then there's wood, like from broken pallets and stuff. And then everything else is like very little. So you can imagine that if I was setting up a program for recycling in here, I would definitely focus on the fiber and maybe set up something in which they could, instead of using a big container, they could do a baling operation and be able to recycle a lot of material. Okay, so let's take a look at what is the typical route that people do in commercial refuse. And this, what I have in front of you here, is a front-loading compactor truck. Probably about 30 cubic yards capacity. And so the forks in the front fit into individual dumpsters, and they raise them up over the top of the cab and into the red box, the compaction mechanism, which is located immediately behind the cab. And then there's a compactor which pushes everything towards the back of the truck. And then ultimately, once the truck is full, they open up the back of the truck and everything can come out. Okay. They either push it out or they lift the whole body up and everything slides out. But a lot of times, because you compacted things, sometimes they get stuck. They're really packed in there, and sometimes you gotta really get them out of there. Well, typically routing is done for fast and efficient collection solely. There's no distinction among sources, and it commingles wet and dry materials, and therefore recovery is hindered by cross-contamination. So when you take a look at a dirty MRF, what they're bringing in is just everything, right? The dirty MRF takes everything that's being thrown away. But really, if you took a look at individual loads, it wouldn't be exactly what you might imagine, that everything is a hodgepodge of stuff. There's actually stratification that goes on. Like as the truck makes its route, it might have picked up first because at the back of the truck, they might have gone to a cardboard retailer and people threw all their cardboard into the trash dumpster, because they didn't want to bother breaking it down. They don't care if it's recycled or not. So they pick up that and it's all cardboard. Maybe they went then to a wood construction site, and at the C&D site there was a lot of wood and rubble and things like that, and they picked that up, and so that gets pushed towards the back of the truck. Then they went to an apartment complex or several apartment complexes, and that's like typical, you know, household trash. And so they put that in there, and that gets pushed back to the back of the truck. And as you can see, even though there's some stratification, now they threw some liquids in there, and that liquid starts to spread into the wood and into the paper, and basically destroying its recyclability. Then it went to a food waste restaurant, to a restaurant where there's food waste. And that added up even more water because food waste is 90% water. So now it's really getting soupy back there. And maybe they picked up several, you know, and so it's really gotten, you know, pretty loaded with water. Then they came back and they went to a cardboard distribution or a distribution center, warehouse distribution center, and picked up a lot more cardboard, related stuff. And then finally ended up at a golf course and picked up a lot of green waste. Okay, when they empty it, it kind of looks like what I show you in the picture, but the cross-contamination, the water just gets sucked up by the dry stuff and everything comes out like a soupy mess. Okay, that does not engender itself to a really good separation at a dirty MRF. Consequently, dirty MRFs rarely get more than 30% recovery. Okay, let's take a look at a dry route. Okay, now we've told the hauler that you need to separate into wet and dry routing. And now you're going to send out a truck to pick up all the dry sources. We reroute everything based on the dry characteristics of the source. Mostly dry recoverable materials, probably about 90%. Low to moderate contamination, maybe 25 to 30%. It becomes very easy to sort, higher market value, light separation needed, and you still use the same truck. Okay, no difference. So let's say that you got source separation going on out there, but people don't do a very good job. They're too busy. The variety of circumstances and reasons why people do or don't do things, right? So now we're picking up, let's say, a retailer, a construction site, a distribution center, an office complex, and end up at a bookstore. And now you can see the stratification is like waste paper, wood, cardboard, waste paper, cardboard. I tell you, this load is nothing but a bunch of recyclables. And and yet the hauler got to pick all this stuff up and charge people the money, okay, for picking up that stuff. And now they have an opportunity to recover maybe up to 90%. That's a good deal. And that's not a problem because the idea is that if people have something of real, if it's enough value to somebody that they want to sort it and separate it at the source, so be it, do it. But if they don't, we have an opportunity to still collect and sort, but the stuff has got a lot better opportunity, recoverability, which enables us to get a high diversion rate. And like I say, most materials in the community are going to be, my gosh, 70% is going to be this type of material. Okay, 70%. So we're going to be able to get a lot better separation. So even if people miss on the source separation, we can still recover on the back end. And that's going to increase the amount of diversion that we can get. How about the wet route? Well, wet route can be stratified as well. We are picking up rerouting based on the wet characteristics of the source, like food markets and hotels and golf courses and food processors and landscapers and things like that. And it's going to be mostly organic materials, probably greater than 75%, maybe even more. The nice thing is that you can lower the amount of contamination because like you can take stuff that might have come from dry sources that end up being a wet contaminant. In other words, a contamination to they can be non-organic contaminants. So when we want to compost, we don't want a lot of plastics, we don't want a lot of metal, we don't want a lot of glass. We can, avoid those types of sources, to make sure that we're getting a much better fraction, wet organic fraction to begin with. So we have less effort to sort out non-organic contaminants, higher compostable value. And as opposed to dry where there's like, you might say, less separation needed, this may require some moderate separation to take out not the um, organic, but to take out the contamination, take out the non-organic contaminants like the plastics and stuff like that that can make composting a difficult proposition. Again, same truck, just like on dry, same truck. It's just that we're repurposing the truck to pick up something different. And it's more of a rational way to pick up stuff. And I tell you, wet and dry route has to be the way that every city needs to do this stuff. So picking up this truck went to a landscaper, then it went to a construction site, it went to a restaurant, then to a food processor, it went to a hotel, then it ended up at a golf course. At the end of the day, a lot of recyclable organic matter. That's wet, and that's no problem because we don't mind. Wet and organics fit together, whereas wet and paper do not. Now, a good, I might say, up to 20% of all the loads coming in, maybe even up to a quarter of all the loads that come into MRFs and transfer stations are roll-off loads. That's a roll-off pictured there. That blue bin on the back of that truck, that's a roll-off, and they're big, but they don't go around and pick up, like houses. They don't go around and pick up apartments. No, they come from an individual source, a single source. And usually what happens with single source is that the same thing happens every day at that source. So materials are consistent. Some are compacted, some are not. This bin that I show you here is non-compacted, but a lot of them are compacted. And so they cram as much as they can in there and get that to the transfer station. And the thing is that if it's compacted, and it's from a source, there may be a lot of light materials, dry material, which is highly recoverable. But if you just toss it in a container, it's very voluminous and therefore you don't get much weight. That's why people use compactors because they want to compress a lot of light stuff and make it heavier. So a compactor filled with cardboard that's compacted to the maximum, uh, if it's uncompacted, it might be a ton in a 30 or 40 yard container. But if you compact it, you could get as much as 5 tons of material. So that makes it a lot more efficient. And like I say, it can be up to a quarter, but 10 to 15% of total loads is probably pretty typical. Well, a final category is not necessarily a category, but a final load type is self-haul. And self-haul can make up to 30% of all traffic coming to a facility, but by weight, it's only like about half that, about 15%. It's sort of the wild card in waste management. Generally, it's single source, a lot of whole goods and products, and they come from like roofing tear-outs, cleanup jobs, remodels, move-outs, and much more. A lot of the stuff is very recoverable, highly reusable, mostly dry, but there are, like I say, small loads. You know, so you got a lot of these folks coming in, like on this picture here, Junk Guys of Houston, we chunk your junk, or 1-800 got junk. They pick up a lot of stuff and they may recover some things, but most of the time it's just brought in and tossed away. I think these are prime opportunities for any facility to sort stuff out, and because they can be very recoverable, but they have to be set up for that. There needs to be reuse opportunities located nearby, and something I recommend for any landfill is that they set up a facility right on the premises for taking a lot of the stuff and providing an outlet so that people from the community can come in and maybe they find stuff that they could use. Wood, you know, um, repairable items, windows, fencing, things of that nature. And a landfill could end up selling some of this stuff. That's how urban ore got started. So it makes for, I think, a pretty good opportunity for folks. Well, thank you. We've come to the end of this presentation. I hope it's been instructive and will be useful for you. There's many, many more things to probably discuss. If you have questions, I encourage you to submit them to me directly at Hulls_John at smc.edu. You can discuss program with your professor, Kim O'Kane. And if you want more information, you might want to take RRM3, Resource Management and Zero Waste for Communities. Okay, so thank you for listening and have a great day.